Well, I'm here with Professor Neil Wynn. Hi, Neil.
Hi, Christian.
And we're here to talk about the 50th anniversary since the passing of the Civil Rights Act. Neil and I have just returned from a symposium which was held at the Eccles Centre in the British Library, in which various people came together to discuss the legacy and impact of the Civil Rights Act 50 years on. Neil, I think one of the interesting things about the Civil Rights Act is that there is often this public perception that it was a direct outcome or consequence of the 1963 March on Washington. And what do you make of that?
Well, yes, they do think of it as that. It's almost seen as the kind of culmination of the civil rights movement and the Martin Luther King speech, I Have a Dream, and then the Act. And actually it's much more complicated than that for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, because it took a heck of a battle in Congress to get it through, a great deal of political manoeuvring. And some people would say, you know, it was as much Lyndon Johnson as Martin Luther King. The other thing to bear in mind is that between the March on Washington movement and the passage of the Act, there was another major demonstration that King was involved in, which people tend to forget, and that was St. Augustine in Florida. And again, that kind of focused people's minds on the racial tensions and racial conflicts that existed in America. They remembered Birmingham, Alabama, and St. Augustine in Florida kind of reminded them of that. But the other point about all this, of course, is that the Civil Rights Act isn't the end of the story by any stretch of the imagination. So it's a highly problematic the way people remember it. And when we celebrate it and we say, you know, the anniversary of this act, and I think in the symposium, you know, people talked about, you know, this groundbreaking legislation, and they talk about 1964 as a transformational year. I think that's highly problematic.
But they do draw attention to the fact that in 1964 also there's the PBS America's documentary entitled 1964, which draws attention to the fact that in 1964 we also had other events that run parallel to, such as the Freedom Summer,
yeah,
which some argued was one of the most violent summers of the 20th century in the United States. So does this commemoration tend to kind of marginalise those events, like you mentioned St. Augustine as well?
Well, I'm not sure it marginalises it, but it kind of makes us forget it. And we also forget, you know, that the Civil Rights Act was followed by another very significant piece of legislation, which you can connect more directly with the Freedom Summer, and that's the Voting Rights Act, which really breaks down the barriers for African Americans in the South to vote. And that's very significant. But they also tend to forget, of course, that in 1964, 1965, in the Freedom Summer, there are 3 people murdered. There are 3 people murdered subsequently following the Selma riot, the Selma demonstrations, and that the levels of violence were to go on, you know, for several years beyond all this. So we do have to look at this period. I think the danger is that in commemoration and remembering, there's rose-tinted glasses, and it's as if, you know, this is the end of the civil rights movement, this is the great achievement, and everything now is resolved. And in fact it isn't. It's to be fought over, literally killing people and destroying churches and violent demonstrations. And of course the rise of Black Power is 1966, and that is occasioned by violent reactions again to a peaceful demonstration connected to the vote.
Well, this is another interesting aspect, is that it was drawn attention, one of the speakers drew attention to this yesterday, that following the Act we have a series of riots in a lot of American cities, right, from New York to Los Angeles. So I guess this brings us to the next issue. What was the impact of the Civil Rights Act? Some argue that it was, you know, a game changer. It was a moment in American history in which kind of things actually were changed by federal action.
Right.
But some would argue that, you know, that it wasn't as revolutionary as that.
Well, I think the historian Adam Fairclough is quite right when he says a couple of things. First of all, he says it's probably truer to see this as just another milestone. I think that's underplaying it. I think it's more than a milestone. I think it's very significant. But he does say that what it is a sort of statement of intent. It's a bit like the Declaration of Independence, which coincidentally is celebrated almost at the same time with Independence Day. There's a statement of aspiration, it's a statement of what should be. Putting it into force, getting the law applied, was going to take years. Battles through the Supreme Court, dealing with white resistance, but actually over time, and probably I would say maybe into the 1970s before it really affects change. It does. I mean, does can legislation change hearts and minds? Not immediately, but perhaps in the long term it makes people accept things, and that people grow up, when younger people grow up in different circumstances, and that it's got a longer term impact. Having said all that, of course, as was pointed out in the symposium yesterday, recent Supreme Court decisions have started to unpack or unpick the legislation, and immediately we're seeing, that some of the attitudes, the racial attitudes, have survived despite this.
This relates specifically to the kind of unpacking of part of the Voting Rights Act,
Right.
isn't it, of Title IV, in which certain states had to kind of federal approval was needed before any voting reform occurred in certain states.
Absolutely. It implied kind of consistent federal control of voting in southern states to ensure that they followed the letter of the law. And now the argument is, well, they're following the letter of the law, everything is okay, therefore we don't need to apply that piece of legislation anymore. The other thing is that in the Civil Rights Act, it dealt with segregation in all places of public accommodation, but also in schools. And one of the consequences of that, of course, was that many white people withdrew their children from public schools and they went into private schools. There's a great deal of racial segregation still in education. But to go back to your point about the riots, I think it's very important to bear in mind again that people tend to think, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act dealt with race nationally, and to some extent that's true, of course, the Civil Rights Act does do that. But really, most of this was aimed at the South and racial segregation, the old Jim Crow system. Many Northerners living in ghettos in Harlem, in Detroit, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in even San Francisco, what does this do for us? How does it impact on us? And again, you mentioned of Martin Luther King at the beginning, I think is very apposite. People tend to forget that after 1965, King was addressing an underlying issue which affected race, and that was economic poverty. Not just for blacks, but also for whites, and the Poor People's March. And there is the cause of many of the riots. And the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act does very little for that in the first instance.
Well, this brings us on to the next Civil Rights Act, which was in 1968, which aimed at housing, particularly. And this affected many of the African Americans who had migrated to urban areas in the late 60s. And it was this was another question which was raised yesterday, was is the Civil Rights Act from 1968 going to receive the same kind of attention 50 years on as the 1964 Act?
I think it's highly possible, because there is a tendency for people to think that the racial issues in America have been resolved, and therefore you don't need this legislation, you don't need this control. However, a lot of that legislation applied to public housing, quite often federal housing, so I suppose there could still be some elements of control over in the private market. It could very well be that people unpick that. The other thing that is clearly the case is that eventually Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty program, again, which was mentioned yesterday and was in the PBS film on 1964, Johnson's remarkable call for economic equality, does begin to have some impact in the 70s and beyond, and you do get a large number of African Americans being lifted out of poverty, and the rise of a black middle class, a black voting class. The transformation in voting in the South was phenomenal. Many people said in the 70s politics was the new civil rights, and the presence of black politicians encouraged people to believe that they had achieved things, but also encouraged some people to believe, well, we don't need any more. And that's really problematic.
Well, just the unpacking of some of these changes today. It was mentioned that Texas, within days of of the Supreme Court ruling that part of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional, had already implemented changes that kind of regressed some of the progress made in the 1960s.
Because one of the consequences of, again, the PBS programme is very interesting in this respect, and I think some of the discussants after the film had been shown yesterday in the symposium raised this, that now conservative Republicans gained in the South, and so the old democratic majority in control of the South have gone. And so what you see at the moment is in southern states particularly, where there's very entrenched conservative Republican administrations, the thing that they are targeting is federal control. And again, somebody said yesterday, it's interesting, you know, the battle is about states' rights. But the interesting thing about that is that that battle now has been fought by Republicans in the South. And so that's why places like Texas and probably Florida and elsewhere will quickly begin to follow suit to attack this federal legislation.
Okay, well, thank you, Neil.
Good to talk to you again. I hope you enjoyed the symposium. It's always good to air these things.
Yeah.